Africans at home and throughout the diaspora. Unity is strength. We've got the power.
Stop the fussing and the fighting. Now's the time to do the right thing.
We need more UNITY. Come.
Stop the fussing and the fighting. Yeah. Now's the time to do the right thing.
In the spirit of Umoja, embrace with love.
Let's do it right now. We've got to do it right. Stop the fussing and the fighting.
Right now.
Now's the time to do the right thing. Let's do it right now. We've got to do it right.
Right now.
Book. So this is when I remind you that we still have a pathological liar in the White House, and one who is a 34 count felon and who is friends with somebody who may be part of the biggest sexual predator ring in modern history. And so we are still going to be seeing what the Epstein files reveal. But right now, we have a person in the White House that is unhinged, as the United Nations saw uh, when he did his address yesterday. But yeah, we got a lot to talk about because there's still genocide going on in Gaza. However, the wagons are circling, and now I think it's like 80% of the United Nations states have recognized Palestine as a state. So the work is being done, y'all. The work is being done, and it's no surprise that the U.S. is still holding out. So we got work to do here in this country about putting pressure on Congress to call for not just a ceasefire, but also defunding the military aggression that only the U.S. can fund, and stop the genocide in Gaza. Um, Last week I told you that there was going to be a busy weekend, and so for me it was very positive, busy but positive. I got to be in community with the Black Radio Hall of Fame, who had their conference here in St. Louis, and I hope we treated them well. But I went to the induction ceremony, so shout out to our friends in Black Radio who, with few exceptions, when they got up to the mic to accept their award, spoke to the importance of the Black voice and Black radio in this particular political climate. And so shout out to them. I was a part of the descendants of St. Louis University, descendants of enslaved people at St. Louis University, and there was some just incredible presentations that happened with some of the folks from the academy around the country, the research that they had done in their particular fields that really helped inform our breakout sessions. So hopefully we help to push that needle forward on the demands of those descendants who helped to build St. Louis University, and now will not trying to get not just credit for it, but get reparations from that. So that was an amazing time to spend with those people. So we have some guests today that have done their own work in their respective fields that's going to help inform this discussion today, as we talk about, or I should say, connecting the dots between dark periods of history that aren't that far away. They happen in at least my lifetime when I talk about McCarthyism. But we have Nancy MacClean here, who is the William Schaaf Professor of History and Public Policy at Duke University. And she is the author of a bestseller called Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America. And now we know that it ain't so stealth. With Project 2025, they just put it all out there for us to see. And she actually, you did a re-edition of a republishing of that just based on what was happening. But last year, she did the Behind the Mask of Chivalry, the making of the second Ku Klux Klan. So Nancy has been all things repression and talking about that. And I know when Project 2025 came out, you were definitely on the speaking circuit, really trying to help people understand this political moment. And folks who did not want to talk about, use words like authoritarianism or fascism, I think you helped them dispel that. Also, Nancy works with me in the coalition called Standing for Democracy. Kidiocus Kidiocus King-Carroll is also in the academy, and he's assistant professor of African and African diaspora studies at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, and he has done a number of publications, all things blackness in women, blackness in queer, blackness in just blackness, because those intersections are very, very powerful. And now all of that is under assault. So me and Kidiocus are work together in the Blacks in the Midwest initiative, which is a collective of scholars, students, activists, organizers are committed to lifting up the struggles and contributions of those in the Midwest and the Rust Belt regions who sometimes get forgotten in between that East Coast and West Coast thing. So we are the Fresh Coast. So welcome, Kidiocus and Nancy, to Voices from the Battlefield.
It's great to be with you, Jamala and Kidiocus.
Yes, say.
So I'm going to just start with how you all are doing personally in your own respective universities, because the MAGA people have made the universities a point of attack, and some universities have buckled under the attack. Some folks have gotten away with all their DEI programs for fear of being defunded. So what's going on your respective campuses before we jump into our topic, which is related, really?
Mhm.
I think to be concise, we're standing on our tippy toes, right? A lot, as you've said, a lot of places have sort of bowed to the sort of pressure from the 47th administration. Thankfully, my university hasn't been one of them. But there are all sort of kinds of external pressures that are sort of being exerted, right? And that do sort of influence sort of decision making at the top. I think there are some things that are beyond their control, right? I do. Particularly with me being in the African Diaspora Studies Department, there has been a pledge to protect us and do that work. But when the pressure comes down hard, who knows what's next. But
Yeah.
yeah, I'll leave it there.
And to that point, Kidiocus, remember when it matters? Well, the university buckled under with the funding that they were supposed to receive to get that new building.
Mhm.
And I was hoping that they wouldn't. They stood firm for like a second, and then, like you said, the pressure came, and they wanted that building and that funding really bad. And so they said, okay, we're going to get rid of some of the DEI.
I mean, it's hard because so many of the sort of public institutions rely on sort of federal funding, state funding, right? And, especially in this sort of era of declining student enrollments,
Mhm.
the sort of need for those funds are always
Yeah.
necessary. So it's
Right, right, right. And what about you at the Big Duke, Nancy?
Well, so I would just say, based on my own institution and what I've observed at others, because I also work with the American Association of University Professors, which is, in the forefront of the fight back on this. But among the supposed leaders in higher education, there are very few heroes right now. You could count them on one hand, and most of them come from institutions that don't depend on that federal funding in the same way, right? Catholic institutions, community colleges, Michael Roth at Wesleyan, where his board thinks that he's not radical enough.
Oh, that's a good place to be in. Yeah.
But seriously, it is bleak out there. I will say there's a great organization that's working particularly at the community college level called Equality for All. So if you have listeners who are in community colleges or who are concerned, they could look that up. But basically, our leadership at Duke is hunkered down and bunkered down, kind of trying not to be seen by this regime, and trying to preserve all that money, right? All that federal money that Kidiocus is talking about. But it's been, even at a very privileged institution with a very large endowment, very frustrating. I mean, they've laid over off of 1,000 people. First, they did it voluntarily. Now they're going to other layoffs, but with no process, right? Like no shared governance, no input from people who would be affected or stakeholders, and that kind of thing is going on, in many places. So I think, if there are folks listening who are at colleges or universities, really think about joining the AUP. It is now a union with AFT Higher Education, and also has advocacy locals, and they're the only ones leading about defending, what should be the values of higher education and trying to get transparency and fairer handling of the cuts that we're dealing with now because of the regime.
Yeah, that part is kind of scary because I think when I first heard about what was going to happen to Harvard, and I'm like, okay, they got a big endowment, they're going to stand tall. I'd be damned if they didn't just buckle. I'm like, well, if they buckle, who's going to stand up for like the state universities? And so we see the power of this authoritarian wave that's going across it, and I want us to really talk about how these are connected to other periods of time when authoritarian raised his head and what happened, and how
Yeah.
people were able to put it in check. So I'm going to start with you, Kidiocus, because this is several years ago when I was had a residency at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And I can't remember what exactly happened, if there was a speaker on campus or I read something, and then it went ding, 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 ding. Senator McCarthy was from Wisconsin. Let me see what else I can find out about this man, because I had done some study, but one of the things I really thought about more as we began to look at what was happening under MAGA was, what was the fight back? What did it look like? And I know people perceive McCarthyism in a very narrow way. They thought it was mainly around the entertainment industry. But talk about the man and the mythology and what he was able to do in terms of destroying careers, lives, livelihoods, in much the same way that's happening now. So who was Senator McCarthy?
I think, to put it simply, right, he was a demagogue, right, who took sort of advantage of a sort of very fractious time. It was the post-war sort of United States. We saw a lot of changes, both on the home front and sort of abroad, right? The growing power of the Soviet Union. And then there were also within the home sphere, there was a lot of sort of changes. With the war, we saw women sort of joining the labor force in larger numbers. We saw increased visibility of queer folks. And for folks like sort of McCarthy, they sort of saw that, this sort of change was a little bit too much, right? And so a lot of that change got sort of conflated under the sort of guise of fighting a perceived communist threat. Often what you'll see with sort of empires that feel that they're under siege, is this the idea that in order to sort of become a more perfect nation, that not only do you have to confront the sort of enemy abroad, right, in this case, the Soviet Union, but you also need to confront the enemy at home. The enemy at home, right, being, communists, women, black folks, queer folks, all of these things, these identities, these positionalities become associated with treasonous activity, right? Because they're sort of outside the moral bounds of what the state deems the right way to be a citizen. So you have McCarthy, who sort of emerges in Wisconsin. And to be clear, his career, his sort of rise in his place at the top was actually quite brief. The work that he did outlasted him for quite a bit. But he, put it simply, he was a sort of a demagogue from Wisconsin who took sort of charge of a very sort of fractious political moment. Uh, and yeah, and so I would put it that way.
So I want to follow up, and you can too, Nancy, with the fact that the Red Scare, which was the fear of communism, which was the boogeyman back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, even some of the 60s, because people may recall that one of the things that they kept saying about even Dr. Martin Luther King was his movement had been infiltrated by communists, or he was a communist, or he's been led or influenced by communists. I mean, if you said communism, people would do an about face and try to run and prove how they weren't a part of the communists. Because to your point, Kidiocus, that was seen as treason, and so you wanted to distance yourself as much as possible. But here comes this man who basically, in a very irresponsible way, said he had the names of 125 people in the, what was it, the army or the armed forces or something,
Mhm.
State
and he
Department.
had yeah, he had nothing.
Mhm.
And so then became this search for who is on this list. And the list became other lists, a list in Hollywood, and people who are familiar with some of the people who had come before them trying to prove that they were not part of, they didn't have membership in the Communist Party. I mean, it was these hearings that like dominated the Senate for a while. So, you think about people who had, some of them didn't even know what the Communist Party was, were being called to defend themselves. So it was a very fearful time, a very scary time. And again, as I said, some of the Hollywood people, producers, directors, uh, their careers were killed on this whole notion. So I think about even somebody like what's my brother's name that was the singer,
Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson.
Paul Robeson. I mean, people saw that over time, the way that they went after him, and there are even video footage of when he performed in New York, of all places, and the attacks on him. So he really suffered. And if you just use him as an example, then you know what happened to white people who were in the entertainment industry. But they sought to just really squash and kill everything that they thought was red. So that's why it's called the Red Scare. Nancy, you want to add to like the whole McCarthyism and start connecting it to like what are some of the ties that were done then that are being done now that we should be
Yeah,
mindful
yeah.
of?
And I think also, we call it McCarthyism then because I think the way that it ended is they were able to focus on this one person, right? And make him, okay, he's really awful. That has nothing to do with us as Americans, right? But McCarthy was almost a latecomer to the whole, red baiting, red hunting project. So the House on American Committee on Un-American Activities was started in 1938 by Martin Dies, a segregationist from Texas. And initially, it was supposed to be going after, extremists of any variety, but he was much less interested in the Ku Klux Klan and the Nazis that were organizing then in the run-up to World War II than he was in the left. And that kind of activity stopped for a while during World War II, not least because, the Soviet Union was an ally of the U.S., but in the war. But then after the war, you still have the House activities going on. And then also the Truman administration, when it decides to make a bid for global empire with the Truman Doctrine in 1947, tries to reassure the Republican right by conducting all these loyalty investigations of people in the federal government. So there were, and because they were private, and because the people who were targeted didn't want to talk about them in public, that was a huge kind of bloodletting of great talent, particularly people who were social democratic. I mean, it was the way that they got rid of people who wanted to extend the New Deal to be inclusive and end the racist elements, to do things for women, to do things for Mexican Americans, Native Americans. I mean, there was really some amazing talent that was in the federal government that they pushed out. So by the time McCarthy comes around in 1950, a lot of that work has been done. The CIO had purged the left-wing unions. The NAACP had been part of a kind of global an identification with the global anti-colonial movement of brown and black people. And that also is a victim of McCarthyism, to pull back to a domestic definition of civil rights rather than human rights. So, connecting that to this moment, we're actually what they're doing in our moment is worse, says the leading historian of McCarthyism in America, Ellen Schrecker. She said back then they were going after individuals, right? Now they're going after entire sectors of higher education, of media, of filmmaking, of all of these things. So it's very troubling. But the methods are very similar, which is not surprising because Donald Trump was mentored by a guy named Roy Cohn, who worked with Joseph McCarthy. I was just listening to a podcast about him this morning, and people agreed, like all these people who knew him said he was the most evil person ever. But he's actually the one that pushed for the execution of both Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, knowing that she wasn't guilty, right? So this is Donald Trump's mentor. And if you look at, there's actually a good documentary about that called "Where's My Roy Cohn?" that I'll end with that. But there's a direct lineage between what went on, in the late 40s and the 50s and the current moment, including in the kind of, take no prisoners, really aggressive, just try to take out your opponent's strategy.
Yeah, I think about, and there is footage available for people who are interested of those hearings on un-American activities. And so to be labeled un-American was really, I mean, almost a death threat. And I even see that now. So this whole fear mongering that's being stoked, and if you don't fit within the guidelines of supporting what's going on, then somehow you are outside of that and you are the enemy of the state. And some of us might have been dubbed that. I know I have been. So how do you get there? And then, it's real easy because all you have to do is do what Karen Latifah did, was like give her opinion, and now all of a sudden she's out of a job at the Washington Post. So I think, and then for us to be going after comedians of all people, but this is not new, because one of the things I was looking at, Nancy and Kidiocus, is like how Hitler was able to do it, and it was clear that they were very strategic. They don't try to do this all in one whop where people they did it very insidiously, as you said, in a stealth kind of way. So they started with Make Germany Great Again and rallying people around that, and then seeing who does not think like that and who thinks outside of that. And so anybody outside of that then became the enemy. But they also had to target educators, the media, shut them down, because those are the people that are the purveyors of education, of awareness, of knowledge, of information. And so the similarities of that to me is so stark. And so when I see attacks on the media, to see how, for example, when Trump told the AP that they were not going to be allowed as part of the press corps because they refused to say that the Gulf of Mexico was now the Gulf of America. And I thought that would be a rallying point for the media, because if you didn't support that, I just don't know what else could happen. But we didn't see it right away. And so if you all could talk a little bit about how this stuff manifests itself, and also at some point the government, and back in the day it was Hoover who played a role probably worse than McCarthy, because he was able to use his power, his authority, his office to target people and to get them to do what he needed to do. So I think that similarity of how people using the government resources, government authority to do what they need to do. So let's stay on that for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that if you want a right-wing revolution, right, one of the things you have to sort of take control of is culture, right? Most precisely, they want control over culture, right? They want control over ideas, they want control over art, they want control over literature, and all of these things. right? They come from the university, they come from they come from queer folks, they come from black folks. A lot of culture is produced by folks who are on the political margins, right? They want control of culture, right? And this is very much the same, as during the Cold War, right? Which is why you saw such a focus on Hollywood, right? It's the same thing. If you can control ideas, if you control the art that's being produced, um, and what's being said in the public square, then you can actually sort of enact the kind of change you want, right? But what that's meant is that they have to use government power, state power to affect that kind of change, because culture comes from I think it works its way up, right? I think partially why you saw such a huge attack in the beginning on the sort of idea of intersectionality, right? Is because one, it came from the academy, it came from the work and labor of Black women, right? And those ideas over the course of 30 years finally began to pervade the national consciousness, right? So the work and theorizing that's done in the university does and has had an effect on in the national arena. And so if they can control that by sort of tamping down on ideas, um, and sort of controlling all of that, right, then they can really sort of take hold of culture and knowledge production. But yeah, I'll end there.
To your point, Kidiocus, the Steve Bannon, I think, is the first one to say this on the right, but they all talk about it and believe it now, that politics is downstream from culture. Right. So they're trying to get their message into all of these spaces that aren't necessarily political, but to recruit there, to hunt, to get the word out, to do what they want to do, and like all fascists in the past, they try to rewrite the national history to say that it's not what it is, that it's not complicated, that it has no blemishes or problems that we need to be concerned about. So like this whole attack on the Smithsonian, and particularly, what people call the Blacksonian, right? The Museum of African American History is really, really telling in that regard. And I just saw that Randy Weingarten, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, has a new book out this month called "Why Fascists Hate Teachers." So I think
Right.
summarize it, right? Like they don't want anybody who engages in critical thought, as you're saying, Kidiocus, whether it's like in the academy or whether it's in culture. They want to police all of that. But just to go back to these connections with the past, for listeners to understand how rabid J. Edgar Hoover was at the head of the FBI, the surveillance file that he kept on Eleanor Roosevelt, the former First Lady, right, wife of FDR, was the largest file ever collected on any individual by the FBI before 1960, right? So, I mean, the First Lady, right? So it's not only, a kind of fascistic repression, but it's also deeply partisan, right? It's about power. It's about knocking out your enemies. It's about making sure that nobody else has control of the levers of power. One other connection I'd make between the 50s and now, the kind of Red Scare in the 50s and now that we don't talk as much about, but I think, really needs attention, is the targeting of Mexican Americans and the forced deportation of Mexican Americans, or also making life such hell for them that they engaged in what Mitt Romney called, and others are now saying, self-deportation, right? Where you scare the hell out of people, you take away their jobs, their livelihoods, and make their lives so miserable that they leave themselves. But huge numbers of Mexican Americans were pushed out, and many Mexicans. I mean, Mexicans and American citizens were pushed out then, and also labor organizers who were Mexican American were targeted, and anyone who was on the left who was foreign born had to face possible deportation. So that was an element of the left and kind of efforts to push back on all this in the 1950s. As there was something called the American Committee for the Protection of the Foreign Born. And I actually just looked it up the other day, and there's like almost nothing on it, right? But it's becoming relevant again as we're seeing these deportations that are targeting people who've been here for decades, targeting people who are leaders in their communities and their labor unions and such. So, there's a lot of craziness and mayhem to it, but there's oftentimes a lot of strategy in who they target and how. as
And
well.
to add to that, right, I think some of the sort of parallels we can also see is this focus right on trans people,
Yes.
right, as sort of this avatar or the sort of American enemy at home.
Yeah.
So many parallels to sort of the policing of, you know, queer folks in the 50s, right? And as
Yeah.
you mentioned at the beginning, Jamala, sort of figuring out who is gay in the army and who's sort of gay in the on Capitol Hill, right? It's so many parallels between
Yeah.
that and today, and then the
There were actually more gay men and lesbians purged from the federal government than communists in the 1950s from the federal government. The story of that is told in a book called The Lavender Scare and a documentary by the same name. But you're so right, Kidiocus. And actually, the first library that the Nazis burned was Magnus Hirschfeld's library about, I forget what the exact title is, but basically it was like recognizing the varieties of human sexuality, and studying that in a kind of social scientific way. And the Nazis were so threatened by that, by the way that it challenged their notion of the proper family and gender and everything, that they burned that library.
So one of the things, just based on what you all are saying, like who got targeted, it seems like there's not much difference between who's getting targeted now. Anybody that's not a white male straight person. And so when you start to look at like the fight back and what has taken us so long to unite those sectors in a more coordinated, more strategic way. What do you think are some of the issues? And Kidio, because I remember that I did ask you about like what was the fight back, particularly in Wisconsin, against Joseph McCarthy. Like, did people then say, "Man, you are crazy. We're getting you out of here"? I mean, he died very young, but he did some damage before he left this earth. And so I'm just wondering if our senses were heightened about the not just the damage that he was doing, but the attack on democracy and attack on all of these different sectors that people, I don't, it seems like maybe they thought, oh, those are individuals with Hollywood, and maybe there's something to that, so I'm just gonna not. But now, I mean, it's like everybody's under attack, and you pitting us against one another, and the MAGA folks are just sitting back throwing stuff, to see what sticks. But at the end of the day, all of these are attacks on the democratic system and on the government structures that help to support the democratic processes. So, what are we up against right now?
there, I think there was sort of dissent against McCarthy, at that time in Wisconsin. But I think similarly to now, a lot of people were afraid, right? We didn't even really see an organized takedown of the House Un-American Activities Committee until the 60s.
Mhm.
And that very much emanated out of labor organizing, right, in Southern California in particular, right, because so much of the discourse had been focused on sort of Hollywood, right? So we didn't really see sustained organizing occur until the 60s, in terms of taking down that committee. And by that time, McCarthy had fallen. Uh, but also there was a lot of pride in McCarthy in Wisconsin, particularly in rural Wisconsin. It was
Very popular.
to have this kind of sort of person on. And because a lot of the country was sort of unified in this idea of sort of fighting a communist threat, right? And so at home in Wisconsin, particularly sort of amongst white rural Wisconsinites, McCarthy was a sort of huge figure. He
Mhm.
had a huge funeral, right? There was a
Mm,
sense of pride about him. And
mm.
I think outside of the sort of spheres that you could imagine, like Milwaukee and Madison, Wisconsin is a very conservative state.
Mhm.
It's a very conservative state. And so a lot of the activism in the community in Milwaukee at that time was sort of focused on internal sort of civil rights activism, the fight for fair housing, uh, the sort of labor activism, all of those things were occurring. And they all sort of contribute to that sort of discourse overall. But there's just a lot of pride in McCarthy, right?
Well,
It's
was there anybody that was targeted in the state of Wisconsin who got called before the HUAC? that then people say, "Oh no, I know them. They're not." So that there was some defense of like individuals that might have said, "Oh, he was accidentally or she was accidentally called," but they're not a communist. So was there anybody from there that helped to raise the awareness that people were arbitrarily and randomly being selected?
I'm unable to name anyone in particular, but of course, we know that sort of occurred outside of Wisconsin too. But
Oh
I don't
yeah.
have a particular person.
I think, well, some of the people from the left-led unions that were purged from the CIO, those unions were active. So I know, like the United Packing House Workers, also turned to much more civil rights organizing when they, after they were purged from the CIO, and they were definitely their leadership were Sunman by HUAC and United Electrical Workers, that same kind of thing. But to go back to Kidiocus's point about this was popular with a lot of people, right? And even after McCarthy was exposed, he was popular. And I think there's a religious dimension to this
Mhm.
that we haven't talked about yet, but is also, I think, another resonant element with our time. And that was McCarthy, was a Catholic, and he was beloved of by Catholic conservatives like William F. Buckley, who was launching, National Review, who wrote a book in defense of McCarthy, vigorous defense of McCarthy. And Catholics, just by their theology, like have had a pro-labor element, since the 1890s, but vehemently anti-communist, right? So a lot of Catholics really led and came into their own during the Red Scare years by being the fiercest, most reliable attackers of communists, and then also white evangelical Protestants. This is the period when how can I be forgetting his name? Franklin Graham, is leading his evangelical tours, and he's talking about how communism is satanic, communism is the devil. Only religion can protect you from it. So this is kind of like a culture-wide thing going on that has very, very deep roots. So very, very difficult to challenge. And one of the things that did make it difficult to challenge too is that the Communist Party at that time was very loyal to, they believed Russia was socialist and they believed whatever Stalin said. So they switched lines and positions so radically, like 180-degree turns, like the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and then working with the U.S. and supporting the Japanese internment even as part of that, and the no strike pledge, and then flipping another way after the war. So many people who had been impressed by the activism of communists in the 1930s, in like the unemployed councils and the labor movement, things like that, a lot of those people were like, I don't know if I can trust you, and didn't like the way they operated in unions and community groups. So it's really, really a complicated picture. But I think, the thing that saves us all and the country was the civil rights movement, which of course, was going back, generations and decades. But that point in the mid 50s where it really breaks through in a popular way, look what King did. It was strategic genius. He lifted up Christianity and the Constitution, right, and the Declaration, so that they couldn't red bait him as effectively as they had previous people. And that, really helped to break through. And once the civil rights movement broke through, then it created, the opening and the mother tongue and the, language and tactics for all these other groups to stand up, whether it's the women's movement or the Chicano movement or lesbian and gay or, even environmentalism, like all of them built on that breakthrough affected by the civil rights movement, by not only by Dr. King, but like SNCC, in the South, and SCLC, and CORE and others. It was the stuff was going on so many fronts when it looked like nothing was happening.
Yeah, Black folks saviors once again. If you're just joining us, this is Jamala Rogers, your host of Voices from the Battlefield, and we are here with Nancy MacClean and Kidiocus King-Carroll, and we are looking at the similarities and the differences between McCarthyism, Trumpism. I mean, these things are wrapped up in patriotism in ways that we still have not been able to break through in a strategic way. Even this is like what, almost 70 years of study. And I know your books, Nancy, have looked at these pretty deeply. And what we are now knowing, even about Project 2025, that may have come out in 2023 and really in a big way in 2024, but it represented like decades of the right coming together, looking at how they were going to take power. So let's talk about that, because then we have to say, well, while the right was doing that, what was the left doing?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, to that point, I think if you look at the endorser groups of Project 2025, and you can find that online, but you really see the highly intentional and strategic coalition the right has built. So heavily funded by fossil fuel corporations, above all Charles Koch and Koch Industries, but also Leonard Leo, who's played such a crucial role in capturing the Supreme Court for the far right. And turning it into a partisan operation with that 6-3 Federalist Society majority. But anyways, you have them. And then the Christian nationalists, right? The Heritage Foundation and these other right-wing groups, and just all the wings of the right, kind of coalesced in creating this document for how to make sure that they got the most out of a second Trump administration. And, as someone who is traveling around the country, talking about this with audiences and trying to alert people to the danger. The biggest problem that we had was people didn't believe it. I mean, they all hated it. Even Republicans hated it. Like, over 80% hated almost all the specific things you'd point out. But as the people who were doing public opinion research and focus groups said, there was a credibility problem, that nobody believed that they would get away with this, that they would go this far, or that they would, that they would do it. And they all thought, well, they wouldn't be that crazy. Democrats would stop them. The courts would stop them. And it's like, no, if you understand the power the right has built, it's highly strategic. They captured the Supreme Court very intentionally, right? And got that 6-3 supermajority, and everything else they've done in this alliance building between unlikely partners, libertarians who used to be anti-religious and the religious right and all the rest of it. It's very, very strategic. So now we have a big challenge before us. We've had big challenges before us before in American history. I'm actually starting a new book about this now. But this is not going to be solved with just a couple of rallies or a set of midterm elections.
And
I get, Kidiocus, because I want you to address this as well. I get that people didn't believe it, but what I am looking at is the organized left. We saw different things, and we knew that if they got that court, mm-hmm. it was going to be all she wrote for everything that we wanted to send up the chain, because they already have folks. And at best, the dissenters can just do that, right? A really powerful dissent. But that's not going to help us. So we were seeing things happen, and we're like, well, this is happening, that even writing on it. But what was it that caused us to be paralyzed? It wasn't necessarily fear, I don't think. What do you think, Kidiocus?
Well, for me, it's very simple, right? The political establishment on the left, right? The Democratic Party is a center party, right? They don't hold sort of progressive ideals, which is why, a lot of the sort of buckling we see, right? You're just astonished, like, how is this happening? It's because it's the Democratic Party is, it's not the same, right, as sort of in the Republican Party, but it's also not a progressive party, right? It's not sort of interested in sort of sustained sort of fighting, because it's also bound by corporate interests, as Nancy mentioned, like the Koch brothers. There are
APAC.
Yeah, APAC. There are all sort of kinds of things there that even sort of manage to sort of get rid of our most progressive folks, like the representative from Missouri, right, Cori Bush, or so my simplest answer, right, is that because the political establishment is not sort of predicated in progressive left-wing ideas, right? Also, I think there's also this idea, right, the sort of the Obama moment, that we sort of entered this sort of thing of sort of race-blind progressiveness, that we could rest on our laurels a bit, and that also wasn't true.
Yeah,
I agree, but I also do think some of this is on us, and the only way we get out of this is if we start, kind of coming to terms with the part that we have control over, because we don't have control over with them, and what they do. So when you talk, Jamala, about the left, I mean, I think, part of the problem is that there isn't like a left, right? It's all fractured, right? And siloed. And we have so many bloody different groups, and every group has an executive director and a comms person and a this and a that. And so a lot of what they do is just organizational maintenance, right? And try to keep the thing going. And also some of that fracture and siloization, I think, is driven by the reliance on foundation funding, in this world, like membership based, dues paying organizations like labor unions have been, declining, across the, except for churches, and they're declining too, but, across the board for some time now. And so much of what we think of as the left, like, anti-racist stuff, feminist, lesbian, gay, queer, environmental, is heavily based on foundation funding. And foundations, like I had a lot of people after my book came out, Democracy and Chance, where people would send me to their funders to tell their funders how they're contributing to this, because they tend to give short-term funding, right? They want to be able to be vain and put their name on some victory. So they want you to do some little local initiative, and I'm not against that. I think it's important to get a local, family leave or wage thing or whatever. But as some people who are in the community organizing world put it to me, is like their funders were making them focus on the local level as we were losing power catastrophically at the state level and the national level. So again, I think some of this is funders, that they've got to be woken up to say this is attacking us all across sectors. We all depend on reclaiming democracy and getting this right so that we can do any of these other agendas. And they've got to start being part of the solution, not just part of the problem. And meanwhile, they're also running scared now because of Trump's threat. So, I just think it's on everybody who realizes that we are facing not just a fascist movement, but a fascist government that is consolidating power in an accelerating way almost every day now. And we still have power. The Target boycott showed that. The getting rid of Elon Musk and his Doge, putting restraints on that showed with the Tesla boycotts. The Jimmy Kimmel thing. Oh my God, that got reversed so quickly. So we have capacity, but we've got to do a much better job of aligning and marching together and prioritizing. Otherwise, they'll just pick us off, one by one by one.
And I'll add to the recent sort of special election in Arizona, where sort of the Democratic representative won by a landslide.
Yeah.
Though there have been victories.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, and I think there are victories, and there is some shakeup in the Democratic Party by the progressive sectors and the moderate, and then probably even some of the rightists, because I think one of the things that really does need to happen is a rethinking of that party. They still have not recovered from the 10 million people who sat out in the 2024 election. And, there have been people who've been telling them along the way they're not doing and what they could be doing better, and they have ignored them. And I'm talking about boots on the ground kind of people. Yeah. So I don't have a whole lot of faith in them. But to your point, Nancy, I think that you're absolutely right about the influx of funding that has really, made a blurred the lines between like really grassroots radical organizations and nonprofits.
Yeah.
And I think for a number of nonprofits who wanted to assert themselves in a radical way also didn't understand the distinction that they were making, because if you're getting funding from somebody, and sometimes you actually have to sign when you get some of this federal monies that you are not going to boycott, be a part of any secondary boycotts of Israel. And so your hands are already tied. So I think for me, there were groups who wanted to be radical and assert themselves in that way, but they could not really do that with the kind of funding that they were getting. And so my thing is like, just be honest about what your capacity is so that the people who are more radical, who don't have those strings, can really give the kind of leadership that I thought we needed. So I think just in terms of how we move forward right now, as a paralyzed country in desperate need of leadership, whether it be the Democratic Party, whether it be unions, how do we see organizing right now? Now, there's been several of those big national mobilizations, no kings, and I think those are fine, but my thing is always protest and what's going to be the demand? Prayer and chants and it's got to be some kind of active verb as on the other side of that. And I really liked what they did in Italy when they did 80 cities went up in support of Gaza, and they say if you all don't do XYZ, we're gonna then this was the unions giving leadership to this. We're going to have a national shutdown. And so if until we really see how to stop the commerce like we did with Jimmy Kimmel, because they said pull those Disney subscriptions, people understood that, but it's got to be something that people really, I'm talking about like the enemies of democracy really feel and understand that we are organized to also take power.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important. I mean, as a historian, I think it's great that we're doing these mobilizations and people are finding each other and building mailing lists and, refusing to let all this be normalized. But we need to be really clear-eyed that it's going to take a much more significant level of disruption and a level of disruption that makes the corporate class start thinking, oh, maybe we shouldn't have thrown in so much with this guy because this stuff was getting messy, and that is something that all the previous periods of significant transformation, we've seen in this country, whether it was like the resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act, which was enormous, in the 1850s, in the 1930s, there were over, I believe, 5,000 strikes with 10 million workers, or something we have, we're not even on that scale at all, right? Or the mass civil rights movement and all the disruptions that fractured, the governing class in the South and changed things up in the North for a while. This is all important, what's happening now, but I think it's also very important that the people who are doing the organizing understand that this is like developing muscles that will have to get stronger, and we'll have to be doing more going forward because they're not going to be stopped by, some rallies and things like that. And, like the Kimmel thing showed, they got to feel it in the pocket, I think, before we get somewhere. And can I say, though, part of it is, too, the left is so fractured and things are so crazy that, just things come up like this, the murder of Charlie Kirk. It just seemed like we were making all this headway and people were focusing on the terrible economy and Epstein. And then this nutty kid, does this thing that has,
has real world implications.
Yeah, exactly. Huge backlash. And then to go back to the point about the Democratic Party, all these Democrats in Congress supported it. So they treated Charlie Kirk, who's I am totally against violence against one's opponents. Murder is horrible, et cetera, et cetera. But we have to be clear about who Charlie Kirk was. He was an aggressive white nationalist, a Christian nationalist. I think I don't have to say anything for this audience because you all know, but that information is out there, and yet the entire Senate unanimously supported that resolution, and 95 House Democrats voted for it, including people who you would think of as allies in safe districts like Jamie Raskin and Rosa DeLauro, right?
How about Jeffries, Hakeem Jeffries?
Yes, who hasn't even supported Zoran Mamdani, right? The most
exactly
come around. So again, I think that all of this means there's going to be like a generational fight over, the soul of the Democratic Party, which, as Kidiocus points out, you can only go so far because they're all dependent on money and they bow to the money. But still, there are good people and there are resources there. But if they don't start feeling like they have to answer to the left, not just run from the right, we won't get anywhere.
I think one of the things, going back to this idea of organizing, is that we need to take back the pulpit, right?
Yeah.
The sort of Christian right very much feel that they have God on their side, right? And that God is sort of leading them. But what we've seen sort of with the history of sort of organizing activism in this country, particularly for Black folks, is that the pulpit has sort of been a vanguard of that sort of systemic change that we need, right? The civil rights movement, a lot of organizing and activism occurs, has occurred because of the religious left, right? Which is why I was very pleased to see quite a few sort of leaders of the Black church, right, in the sort of aftermath of the Kirk shooting, condemn violence, but also very much say, this was not a great person, right? This is white supremacy. We need more religious leaders who are willing to call all of this what it is. Unfortunately, right, Christian nationalism, is on the rise, right? And they do have a lot, even within the Black community. You saw Black
Yeah.
church leaders having prayer circles for Charlie Kirk, right? But also, I would say they are not representative of that. And you had just as many sort of Black church leaders who were, condemning the political violence, but also calling us to remember that these are white supremacists.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think
And
that's
Kidiocus, I saw a couple of those folks on social media, these black clergy who were speaking against them. And one started out by saying, "I didn't even know who Charlie Kirk was," and a lot of us didn't know who he was. Then when folks started to Google him and see how all the anti-hate, the homophobic stuff that he was espousing. I mean, attacking Dr. Martin Luther King. I mean, people are like, whoa, this is who these people are like rallying around. So I think they did cut through some of that in ways that probably lay people couldn't do. So yeah, kudos for them
yeah.
for doing that. Nancy, you're gonna jump in.
I was just going to say, I think the point that Kidiocus was making about leadership from faith, faith leaders is really, really important to break through in this moment. And I'm from North Carolina, where Bishop Barber, William Barber, is from. And so, I think he's done a great job developing a kind of prophetic faith that is, pro-poor people. That is, what Jesus talked about, not what the religious right talks about. But I think there's a lot going on, though, too, that we don't see now. So, like in 2024, in the run up to the election, I was traveling with a documentary called Bad Faith, Christian Nationalism's Unholy War on Democracy, looking at how the MAGA movement and the attack on the Capitol, in the country on January 6th was coming from this, really heavily anchored in this really frightening Christian nationalism. And what I got to experience in that and see is how many faith leaders quietly, white and Black, are trying to have these conversations with their congregations about Christian nationalism and try to understand what it is and what the threat is and empower and equip people to call it out more confidently. So I think sometimes I like to think, like, if it's like whatever 30 years from now and we try to explain, to the grandkids or whatever, like how we won, like what would we point to? And I think that would be, an element, having those hard conversations now with people
Yeah.
who really need encouragement.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think, this obviously to be continued. And I think the fact that we don't want people to feel paralyzed, immobilized, because as you said, Nancy, every day there is something going on that requires us to be responsive. And what I'm telling people is don't go for all of that stuff. It'll mess your head up and your heart and your soul and everything else. Pick one thing and just focus on that. Find your people. Make sure you protect your voice, your vote, and your pocketbook. Those are the power sources that you have control over. And let's just do what we think needs to be done, because it's the lack of organizing that's causing us to lose ground. And
Yeah.
so whatever we can do to push that forward, I think we have. One of the things that was pissing me off is this whole notion about both sides are responsible for the political violence. And so I did a piece for Black Commentary that's up on the website, because when you start to look at where the violence is coming from, when you start to look at who controls the media, all of this is consolidated right-wing stuff. So, and it really pissed me off when folks on the left say, yeah, we need to stop doing that. No, you can't even compete with these people, you knuckleheads. You need to know what your history is and you need to know the facts. But,
Yep.
So many of these guys are like politically incoherent, right? That, we find out who they are and they're like, oh, no. Yes, some left-wing talking points, but
Yeah,
a lot of it's
exactly. I mean, they're nuts, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, these people who are doing
Yeah.
assassination attempts are nuts, you know.
Yeah,
And it's
absolutely.
so, somebody else was pointing out in a conversation that I was in, like it's the opposite. That is the opposite of a left politics, which is about building collective strength and power. It's not about, you know, crazy individual acts. So yeah, and as you said, Jamala, like apparently on the now I now call it the Department of Injustice. There's no reason that we should credit them with any name that suggests that justice is going on there. But they had a study up about domestic terrorism that pointed out how it's overwhelmingly, you know, from these right wing ideologues and groups, and they took it down. You know, they took it off the website. But I think, you know, we've got a lot of popular education ahead of us, right, to help people understand this.
Yeah. So I think we need to continue. We need to intensify our conversation with each other. If you want to see this show again, it'll be up on my website, JamalaRogers.com, any of the other columns that I've done. But yes, this is Jamala Rogers, your host, and I hope to see you on the battlefield.
Great to be in conversation with you too, and wonderful to meet you, Kidiocus.
Yes,
Jamala, great to reconnect.
Right now.